Good morning, everybody, afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are joining us. Thank you so much for attending the Daring Cities 2023 Virtual Forum. My name is Andrea Fidalgo, and I work as the Europe Program Manager for the Institute of Human Rights and Business. And today I'll be moderating our session. So today's webinar will focus on the topic of sustainable and affordable housing for all, insights on socially just decarbonization of buildings from academia and practice. So we know that the built environment contributes to 37% of energy-related emissions globally. So decarbonizing the residential building stock is therefore mission critical to address the climate emergency that we are going through. And to ensure that this process is socially inclusive and we leave no one behind, local governments need to align their climate targets with social equity goals. So today we are exploring what this means for local governments, and we'll be hearing from city practitioners to academic experts working in this field. Before I introduce our distinguished panelists, we will briefly introduce the three projects that we'll be exploring today: the Building for Today and the Future project, the Include and the Malmö Commitment projects. And thereafter, the bulk of the session will focus around the panel discussion, where we'll be exploring several aspects, amongst them which policy tools do local governments have to address this, how can academia support it, and how do different actors fit in the process. At the end of the event, we'll also be launching a policy brief on the role of local government in advancing a just transition in the built environment. So I hope you all stay with us and contribute to this conversation. We'll have the chat open, so you feel free to pop your questions, and we'll reserve some time at the end, if possible, to answer some of your questions. So to start, I will introduce the Building for Today and the Future project, which is a collaboration between IHRB and ICLEI. This project, we aim through research and narrative building, create a strong evidence base for policy and decision makers and investors that are influencing the built environment space to have an international recognized reference point for action on just transition, and that they can put it into practice. More specifically, this project involves action research and visioning sessions in 8 cities globally. There you can see in the slides in the presentation which cities I'm talking about, and we are looking on how climate action and our decarbonization processes are impacting social and human rights at the local context. And the idea is that we can then contribute with our findings to change policy and financial practices in the built environment. And we do this always with a human rights-based approach, specifically focusing in 4 different areas. So we are focusing on the right to housing, including elements such as, for example, security of tenure, availability of services, affordability, which have all taken additional significance in the context of the climate crisis. We are also looking at labor rights, specifically at construction workers on site and through supply chains, and this includes amongst others, the freedom of association and collective bargaining, social dialogue in the transition process, non-discrimination, ensuring a safe and healthy work environment. The third topic we are working with is spatial justice, where we take into account the spatial dimensions of who shapes, who benefits, and who risks losing out in this transition. And lastly, co-creation and meaningful participation, drawing on the human rights, meaningful participation, and the right to the city, emphasizing the right not only to access what exists in the city, but also the right to change it and to have a say in it. Next, I will hand it over to Karis Hoffman, who will talk us through the Include project and introduce the Malmö Commitment. Karis, over to you, please.
Thank you, Andrea. My name is Karis Hoffman. I'm a Circular Development Officer at the ICLEI World Secretariat based in Bonn, Germany. I'm speaking today on behalf of my colleague Ingshi Deng Sommer, who cannot join us today. So in addition to the Building Today and the Future project, which we're working on with IHRB, we're then also working on 2 other projects that are then focused on the just transition in cities. One of them is the Include project. So this project focuses on just and inclusive climate action in 5 German cities. So these are the cities of Bonn, Heidelberg, Ludwigsburg, Dortmund, and Essen. And we're also working with global cities through matching these cities together. So the project aims to then improve social justice outcomes in existing climate initiatives. The target initiatives are, for example, ensuring that retrofitting subsidies are accessible to residents throughout the city. So you will be hearing more on this from Christopher Zadlowski, who is joining us from the city of Dortmund today. And the reason that we're really focusing then on the climate initiatives that are already existing is because they're essential for a sustainable future. But we see that climate initiatives can often also disproportionately impact marginalized communities. So it's really important to ensure that we're not leaving anyone behind in this transition to sustainable cities. And so that's why we're making sure that these initiatives are then actively reaching out to involve all city residents, regardless of their socioeconomic status or background. As part of this project, then there will be a collaboration with international frontrunner cities to ensure that their best practices get taken up by different local governments globally, so that we can really scale the efforts that we see in the cities and what works in the cities. Next, I'll introduce the Malmö Commitment. So the Malmö Commitment was launched last year in May 2022 during the ICLEI World Congress in Malmö, Sweden. It aims to empower local and regional governments to prioritize people and social equity at the core of their local sustainable development to ensure that no one is left behind. So 11 pioneer cities have already joined us around the world across 5 different regions. So this includes the city of Malmö, Sweden, Makati City in the Philippines, Porto Alegre in Brazil, just to give you a few examples. You can explore the cities on the website to get more detail. And they have identified some key sustainability challenges that they will be focusing on during the next years. So you can see which different challenges they're then focusing on the website. And Johanna Vinro is joining us from Malmö City today, and she can give you more insight on the commitment as well. And sustainable and affordable housing has really been one of the major challenges identified. So right now the cities have already surveyed vulnerable communities in their city, and then we're working with them to design social equity indicators to measure the impact of their policies then on the different populations and monitor their progress on these social indicators. So we will be continuing to support them along this process. And if you'd like to join this process or you would like to know more, you can scan the QR code and you can visit the website. And we also have contact details of our colleagues working on the Malmö Commitment, so you can reach out to them. Thank you very much. I'll hand back now to Andrea to facilitate the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Caris. I think all the projects that we've brought here today are really worth discussing. And the panel that we gathered today, as Caris mentioned, has some of the people working directly in this project, so we'll be hearing from them as well. So I would like to now briefly introduce our distinguished speakers. We have with us Ivan Tozics, who is an urban explorer with experience in Eurocities and Urbact. Is a member of numerous international collaborations in the EU and outside of Europe through UN Habitat links and different projects. His speciality is in deep dive involvement in the new member states, and he has published extensively on topics like integrated urban development, urban renewal, metropolitan areas, EU urban policies, amongst others. We also have with us Johanna Vinroth, who's a policy officer for urban development and housing at the city of Malmö in Sweden. And she's a human geographer working in the field of strategic urban planning and currently focusing on housing, migration, and sustainable development. We'll also be hearing from Christopher Sadolski. He's the head of climate advisory board at the environment department of the city of Dortmund in Germany. And before joining the Dortmund city administration back in 2019, he worked in academia on topics of geology and botany, where he also holds master's degrees in biodiversity. And lastly, we'll be also hearing from Julia, who is an urban planner specialized in sustainable urban development with an extensive experience in both national and international settings. And she's currently undertaking the research in Jakarta, Indonesia, for the Building for the Future, Building for Today and the Future project. So I would like to kick off this panel discussion to address you all with this not so simple question, but how do your work relate to making housing more sustainable, and how does social equity factors in? And I will give the floor first to Julia, because I know she prepared a few slides for us. So Julia, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Andrea. And I think good morning and good afternoon for everyone. So I actually would like to introduce you to the research that I'm doing all together with HRB, which is, looking at Jakarta from the lens of climate and social justice in the built environment. But before that, I would like to dive you into the city and also the research that we are doing shortly. Next, please. So actually the research will be done in like 8 cities, and I'm responsible to do it in Jakarta. As you can see, the map is it's a flipping forward, just because we would like to give a little bit a different perspective on the research that we are doing. And as you can see, like Jakarta, I think is maybe one of the biggest cities out of the 8 that the research is covered. Next. And as you can see, Jakarta, when we look at Jakarta is not just a province, because it's actually a metropolitan cities, and it is inhabited by more than 30 million people, and it is considered metropolitan cities, and the size is as big as you can see here on the screen. It can be as big as Seoul, can be as big as Tokyo. It's actually massive of people that living here. Next. And if you can see, and we relate like how is actually the issues of spatial and climate and social justice in the case of metropolitan Jakarta, I think the several points that can be identified is the first. Reclassification is actually the new definition of urbanization that happens in Jakarta for the past decades. And what I meant with reclassification is because the surrounding of the city become bigger and bigger and bigger, not because people from rural areas coming to Jakarta for work, but the surrounding areas is transformed into like urban characteristic in terms of the spatial characteristic, but also the economic activities of people. So no more agricultural activities. If you look at Jakarta. And another one is because I think this today we specifically talking about housing. What makes me sad is because the affordable housing is situated outside the metro core. So you can see there. So the blue and the purple is actually is a built environment of the city. And the black dots are actually the subsidized housing development that happened in the city. And you can see that the black dots of the subsidized housing are actually situated outside the metro core, in which in the sense that many people need to have a long commute every day from their house to the work or go to school, because all these like jobs, best schools are located in the metro core. So what is the implication? The implication are two. So the first implication is because there's a decrease of productivity for so many people in Jakarta, because they have to get up I think around 3 a.m. in the morning to go to work, and they need to go back from the work. Sometimes they need to waiting for the traffic to be calmer, so they go home, meaning that they will arrive in their home I think around 10 or 11 p.m. in the evening. So with that such short period of rest almost every day, that you can imagine how can they face their life, and that affect the productivity, of course. And the second one is, of course, when we talk about decarbonization, this spatial condition does not really lead to decarbonization, in the sense that the longer you commute to work or to school, meaning that the bigger of the greenhouse gas emission that we produce because of this situation. So now, to end my presentation, I think I would like to say to everyone that, do you think that this condition is already just, is already fair for everyone, where, like a certain, some people that can live in the city, they can travel with the shorter distance, and the dominant population need to travel longer, with insufficient means of transportation. So that's how this condition now, and hopefully, by the end of the research, we can formulate or give recommendation for like a better, maybe policy recommendations, or even like urban management recommendation. Thank you, and back to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Julia. It's really fascinating, your research in Jakarta, and thank you for sharing it with us. I will now pass it on to Christopher. If you could also, you're involved in the Include project, so if you can also talk a little bit about it. So how does your work relate to making housing more sustainable, and how does socially equity factor in?
Yes, hello everybody from Germany. I'm the head of the Climate Advisory Board, which was funded in 2022. And the Climate Advisory Board is an independent committee of the City Council, and the participants are from all over the city society. So what we do in regards to sustainable housing, but also in regards to all other topics in climate change or climate adaptation, is we work on recommendations for the city council itself to strengthen and fasten also several projects in this. And for this, we have, for example, the project team for sustainable buildings, which includes new buildings, but also existing buildings. And in this project team, we think about how can we make buildings, new and existing ones, more sustainable, and can we change the idea that we need to demolish all our old buildings and build them new and in new sustainable ways, or can we use these existing buildings with hopefully minor projects to make them more sustainable. And with this, especially in the Climate Advisory Board, we include the thought of social equity in nearly every project, because we know that for climate change and climate adaptation to work in the scale we're talking about, we need to have all people, all citizens working together. So it is not possible for us as the city itself to say, okay, we might be climate neutral by the year X. So for our buildings, for our work, but this doesn't include all our citizens. So we have to work with them together. This is also one thing we have in the environmental department, the development of sustainability building standards. So these standards are in the first place for us, if we build new buildings as a city, that those buildings are sustainable. The future or the bigger idea is that we develop these standards and we give them out to everybody who's interested in the standards, that we give them out to major construction companies, to citizens itself, to function as a guideline for sustainable buildings. So at least that we can make all the buildings we build in the near future, and to be honest, in the future itself, are sustainable. The social equity was one part that we have in mind all the time, but at the moment there aren't good measurements in the city of Dortmund to see, okay, is this really social equity or not? And this was one part why we wanted to join the Include project to have a better idea and understanding, okay, are the projects we're going to plan are really on the edge of social equity, or can we do more, and can we see, okay, this was a better project than another, so we will shift our future projects towards the more social equity projects. And with that, for the short time, I think that's it.
Thank you so much, Christopher. It's always a problem when we are dealing with social equity that there's not so many indicators and data around, so it makes it more difficult than for practitioners and the municipalities to say, you know, we have this precise data showing that this project is socially inclusive, or it accounts for social equity factors. So now I will ask Johanna, and given your involvement in the Malmö commitment, how does your work relate to making housing more sustainable, and how does social equity factors in?
Thank you, Andrea. I will start with the Malmö commitment, because Malmö has been working it's been a city that's been growing quite much like the last 2 decades. And with the new housing, we've been focusing a lot on sustainability, and especially then ecological sustainability, and to try to find new solutions and test new solutions. And with the Malmö commitment, we also seen that we still have sustainability challenges that we need to focus more on. And affordable housing for all is one of them. But also sustainable food for all, and equitable and socially sustainable economy. So there are more questions to dig deeper and to try to find solutions for. But when we talk about affordable housing, we do have a policy for housing supply that all the municipalities in Sweden should create. And this one is built on statistics about the housing market and the people living in Malmö. And as I said, it's been a city that's developed a lot. And we're also a very diverse city with people from many countries, and talking a lot of different languages. And we've also seen that the income levels, they're not equal, to put it simply. And then it does mean that affordable housing is one of the topics that we really need to address forward, to make sure that we have a sustainable housing market. And to do this, we maybe we have to start to look more, not only about the new buildings that we're building, but also to focus on what we already have, because that's usually where people can actually afford to live. But we want to make sure that they have also sustainable housing. And we do have for example, we do have a company for housing that has about 26,000 apartments in the city. And of course, it's a really important tool for us to use when we talk about affordable housing, and to make sure that they when they renovate, they do it in a way that's sustainable, both ecologically and also socially. We do also we are developing a model for the new housing, to see if we can try to create good buildings, but still that has a lower rent than in the normal market today. And there we are using the land that the municipality owns, to see if we can somehow use this to lower the rents for those new apartments. So there are some of the things we're doing in the city right now.
Thank you so much, Johanna. Yeah, it's even within the public housing stock, the question of affordability is always, an issue, because it's affordable for whom, right? And when we have a city with a lot of diversity and different income levels, then affordability means different things for the different families. Thank you so much. I will now give the floor to Ivan. Ivan, so how does your work relate to making housing more sustainable, and how does socially equity factors in?
So first, I have to start with the Metropolitan Research Institute, which is a small independent think tank in Budapest, existing since 1989. I am personally an urban explorer, working since long on housing and urban issues, especially in poorer areas of cities. And I am especially interested in comparisons between different cities and in the question how cities can learn from each other. This started with my Eurocities involvement when I was representing Budapest, and since 2011 I am an urban thematic program expert organizing knowledge exchange. In this process, we organized capitalization projects on urban regeneration, and it is very interesting how you can carry out area-based urban renewal without leading to gentrification, because all these kind of interventions might have gentrifying effects. Most recently, I organized a project called Walk and Roll Cities, which was based on overview how you can replace mobility with accessibility in cities, meaning that to making the accessibility the leading factor and not providing faster and faster urban transport can change cities. And road and public space regeneration can also help the city to handle affordability problems, giving more space for new housing and making existing housing more accessible. My special flavor is that I am from a post-socialist country, and I could have an overview about the long process, how the socialist system functioned, how it collapsed, how a totally free market system has been established, and what kind of new challenges emerge when moving towards a regulated market. Unfortunately, within this process, affordable housing has been privatized, and the small stock remaining in public ownership further deteriorated. So Budapest is now, although it does not have a housing shortage, it has a huge affordability problem. A final sentence is that my conviction is that affordable housing is not only a local problem. Cities themselves have limited means to handle affordability if the national government is not helping, etc. And it is not only a housing problem. All other policies affect it. So if you make brave regeneration interventions or brave decarbonization efforts, this may also lead to the decrease of affordable housing. So this is a very interesting and very, very complex process.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And to continue, I'll continue with you, because I would like to hear your thoughts on the positioning of equity in the built environment, then within the context of a city.
Okay. I think we can talk about equity in the built environment as a static concept. So we can talk about inequalities, about spatial segregation, but we can also talk about equity about a dynamic concept, because these things are changing due to urban growth or migration or interventions into the stock, like urban renewal or energy efficient renovation. As I told you, I was studying urban renewal in many cities, and my special interest is on the trade-off between environmental and social aspects. It happens many times that the seemingly straightforward environmental interventions, improvements, lead to the eviction of the poor, and this is what we call renoviction. My statement is that the city does not only consist of buildings and streets, but also of people. This is obvious, but it is less obvious that any type of interventions to improve the building stock or public space affects the residents, either creating better chances for their life or the opposite, forcing them to leave the building. And unfortunately, social externalities are in many cases more problematic than the eventual environmental improvements. So it is a huge task to find the balance between environmental and social interventions. And this is equally true for normal urban renewal and decarbonization interventions. Now, unfortunately, I did not present a picture for you, but if I could present a picture for you, I would show you the picture of a 9 or 10-story high, quite nice building in Rotterdam, where on every second balcony there is a statement, "Don't demolish us." And the issue is that this is a city center building, and the local government wants to demolish the building, giving space for a higher building, which they say it is important for the compact city development. I think that you should rethink 1,000 times when you demolish an existing good quality social housing building. The social costs of this demolition can be much higher than the gains which you gain with a new skyscraper. And finally, there are many political fights in every city. Every city is to find the balance between this environmental and social factor. And I think it is not only the city which can make a decision about that. You can make the best what you want if you are a city where the national government does not have a social welfare system, where you are left alone to make this decision, then your decision will not be optimal. So I think that to solve this problem is really a multi-level government task, where the different government levels, including the EU, which we will talk about later, has to take their part.
Thank you so much, Ivan. And to the point that Ivan made between this trade-off between the environment and sustainable residential buildings, then vis-a-vis affordable housing, I would like to ask Julia, Johanna, and Christopher, within your own cities, what do you see as the key priorities, barriers, and pressure points with respect to these sustainable residential buildings and affordable housing? Can we have it all? Julia? Yeah.
Okay. Yes, I think if we look at Jakarta and I reflect on Jakarta itself, I think the always emphasis when you talk about sustainable residential building or affordable housing and social justice is always on the people. So we will not have any justice, any fair development if people are not included to some extent, right? Like, give me example that justice can be achieved without people. Like I cannot find an example. So that is the key priorities. Like the people needs to be involved in all sectors of development. Housing, transportation, like anything, it has to be involved since the beginning, not just like become the object of tax, the object of votes, the object of law. When the policies happen or the development happen, then people just get the impact. Like Ivan mentioned, right? There's no consultation, and suddenly the city government would like to demolish the building, but have never been consulted or explained why this building needs to be demolished and what is the impact for them, right? I think the people need to be included since the very beginning. And I think the other priority is here how to with the urban development, urbanization that happened massively in Jakarta and other big cities in Indonesia. The one thing that is also missing is how to distribute the benefits of urbanization to all of people that living in Jakarta. Like I mentioned earlier, that there are some people that can live in the city with a short amount of distance to go to work, to go to school, the best school, high-paid job. But there are also other people that need to commute 3 even more hours to go to work, right? So that this is illustration that the benefits of urbanization that happen in Jakarta massively, because Jakarta hold the key of more than 20% of the national GDPs. It's quite big compared to the other cities in Indonesia. But unfortunately, this illustration give us the feeling that it's not distributed very well. So back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Julia. Christopher or Johanna, to you.
Yeah, I guess if we talk about barriers and pressure points, there is one big pressure point besides the including of all the people. It's just the financial situation or the financial resources that the people, so the landlords as well as the tenants have. And the big problem here in Germany at the moment is that we also have a shortage of skilled workers. So even if there are people that want to do energy saving measures for their home or for their apartment building, they often can't find the workers to do it. And so the projects lay down for 1 year, 2 years. And we also have a rather complex financial support system at the moment. So there are financial support systems, but some are possible to combine, some are not, some are excluding others. And as a, let's say, normal person that isn't working with this stuff, it's rather complex to see, okay, I want this, this, and this, but can I have them all? Can I get the funding or not? And when we look at the city of Dortmund, we have a high proportion of tenants. So we're talking about minimum 75% tenants. The energy saving measures that are done will increase the monthly rent. And with an unemployment rate of around 11% and around 1/3 of the citizens in Dortmund earn less than the national average, this increase in monthly rent, even if they want the energy saving measures and a sustainable housing, they can't afford it. And I guess this, at least for our city, this is one of the major problems, that we have people that want these measures, that want have sustainable housing, but they still can't financial support this in any way.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it's a scenario that we see in a lot of cities across Europe, and I guess globally as well. Johanna, from your perspective in Malmo.
Yes, I feel like we have a similar topics to talk about in, like with Dortmund, that we also have a quite high unemployment rate, and even though we do try now, as I said before, to take measures to see if we can create more housing that are like lower in rent, for example, the main issue is that actually that people, they can't afford, and because they don't have a job. So I think it's like sometimes when we talk about, to not only talk about one topic at a time, but to talk about more things at the same time. We need to work with social housing, or not with social housing, but with housing that are socially affordable, and then we need to talk about people getting employment to be able to afford the housing. Also, when we it also created a network here in Malmö that is called LFM30. It was first an initiative from the city, but then like the actors in the building sector and the property owners, they are now having this how do you say it, this network by themselves, but there is a dialogue between them and the city, and their focus is on sustainable housing, and they're also looking a lot at those like decarbonization in the housing stock, for example. But it's really important. I can see that it's really important there also to have someone to have the dialogue with when someone is changing or renovating a house. How do we do it in a way that it doesn't increase rents so much, for example? And with this network, it's like a platform to actually have those discussions, and for the different companies to see, okay, you can do it this way, maybe I can do it in a similar way, so can we learn from each other as well? And how can the city learn from these dialogues, for example? So again, to look at it in like in a multi-sector way, to not talk only about one topic at a time.
Thank you, Johanna. And all of you kind of answer a little bit my next question, which is towards what risks do you see in your work to socially inclusivity when we are working towards decarbonization? And for example, one of the points you raised is renovation, so evictions led by renovations of the building stock, or the fact that the rents increase so much that leads to displacement, where people have to move to a different area of the city, which can then increase their commuting time, and that poses also risks to their work. We talked about how can even people, given their economic status, even if they want to be part of the process of decarbonizing their houses, they just can't afford it. So do you want to add any other risks you see in your cities that are connected with social inclusivity and the work towards decarbonization of the built environment? Ivan, please go ahead.
I would bring this discussion on a higher level, and this is the EU level, because obviously we have these problems in our cities, but how are the EU regulations helping or not helping to handle this situation? And I think the main risk is in the differentiation in the speed of the environmental interventions compared to the social protection measures. The real risk is that the EU has strong commitment towards decarbonization, and this is supported also by strong legal instruments in the environmental policy in the form of compulsory directives, for example, the Energy Performance Building Directive. This in itself would not be a risk. This is very good. But the risk is that the EU is lacking similar strengths in the social domain. Thus, the EU can only suggest and financially support social protection measures, but the decision-making about such measures is in the hands of the national governments. So it can easily happen that the EU directive makes it compulsory the deep energy efficient renovation of buildings, but the national level is not giving any accompanying social protection framework to protect the poor people. And in such a case, the local governments are in a big trouble because they have to fulfill the deep renovation requirement, but they are unable from their own financial means to pay to compensate people who would otherwise lose their flats. So I think this is a serious risk. Without rapid and targeted deployment of policy instruments to support the most vulnerable households, in some countries, I would only talk about some countries, because in many countries it is self-evident that the national government will help the social protection measures and it will not let this on the local governments. But anyway, there are countries where this is a danger. This would lead to strong renovation, but also to a fact that the political chances to carry out the carbon pricing and decarbonization efforts will become questioned by political forces. So if these two things are not going hand in hand, and unfortunately the legal background is not the same for the two things, then this is a real risk, in my opinion.
Thank you, Ivan. And now to the rest of the panel. So do you see these approaches to decarbonization and social equity, are they combinable? We're talking about the risks to social inclusivity and also the risks then to fall behind into the decarbonization processes. Do you see them as combinable somehow?
Yes, if I may add a little bit, Andrea, on the risk. I think especially in Southeast Asian cities, the risk relies on how the cities are governed and managed. What I meant is, when we talk about decarbonization, it is always a long game. We cannot achieve decarbonization in city with only 1 year or 2 years of action, right? It is a very, very long game. It could be like 20 years, it could be like 10 years, depending on the city's capacity. But what happened in Southeast Asian cities is all of the development plans and how the cities are governed are based on the 5 years political cycle. So every 5 years, there will be like election for local governments, and there will be like new leaders coming in with the whole new vision, and sometimes the trend say that this new leader will kind of like erase all of the previous like programs developments that have been done in the previous administration, meaning that every 5 years you start with a blank canvas. Now, when the decarbonization is a long-term game and the urban management is doing it incrementally, like 5 years we start with a canvas, 5 years start with a canvas, how can we even able to achieve the decarbonization, right? So I think the solution or the key that can be done for this kind of to break all the cycle is, I think we need objectivity from the leader. So the leader, whoever sits in the head of the government, I think they need to see, they need to evaluate in a very objective lens which program are good to achieve decarbonization. Okay, you go ahead, and no matter who initiate that. However, if there are programs that are not good or there's no benefits for the people, it's not giving any justice, not giving any benefits, evaluate them and improve them. If it cannot be improved, then sorry, I think we have to stop it, right? And then the other solution that we can see as well is to strengthen the technocratic level, because in the city government sometimes is a very top down. So whatever your boss said, that is the man that you have to do. You have to do on the ground, and they sometimes do not are given explanation like why they have to do that and what is like the reason behind it. They just like receive it as it is. It is not be sustainable if you talk about decarbonization. They need to be explained like why, and then I need it to be strengthened in terms of capacity. So leader can come and go, but the technocratic level need to be strengthened because they work for the city for a longer period of time. I've met people who work in the city for 30 years, like starting their career in the city government until they retire, and they still like living in, they still like working in the city government with the same department, meaning that they know all of these stories, what the city needs, what the development and so on, and they need to be strengthened. So whoever the leaders is on the government, the technocratic level can remind them, hey, sir or ma'am, we already have like this 20 years of plan to achieve decarbonization. This is a priority, but if you see that there's like evaluation, let's evaluate together, not just like starting a blank canvas. So I think that's one of the risks. Back to you, Andrea.
Thank you so much, Julia. Now, Christopher and Johanna, do you have any points you would like to add? Yes, Christopher.
Maybe just a short thing. I think the question is not if the approaches of decarbonization and social equity are combinable. They just have to. So we are very past the point that we can look at problems as a singular thing. So we can't look just at climate change. We can't just look at social equity. We can't just look at whatever. These problems are so combined, and they will even be more combined in the future, that we just have to be aware of them and that we have to think all of them. So we can't think sustainable housing without social equity. We can't think sustainable housing without climate change adaptations. And at least in my opinion, this is a thinking that some people just need to understand, that we can't see this problem separate. They are all combined and we have to attack them combined.
Thank you, Christopher. Yeah, I agree with you. These are not like isolated silos. This is a very complex and intricate problem that we need to solve or try to solve at the same time. So we talked a little bit about different strategies, policies that could be used, different tools. And yes, Ivan, go ahead, please.
Sorry to interrupt, but I would join the words of Christopher. These two things have to be combined, and I think they can be combined. I have read a very interesting analysis of the European Trade Union Institute, which made a simulation that the prospective revenues of the ETS2 system, which is the revenues from carbon pricing from the building and transport sector, if this is 100% given to the lowest half of the population, then the problem is solved, because even the lowest income people will get some gain, welfare gain, and in the meantime their buildings can be renovated. If only half of this money is given to the lowest income groups, then there are already problems in this lower parts of the population. So it depends on the allocation of the social protection money, which could come from the ETS2 system. But again, I have to emphasize that the allocation of this money is in the hand of the national governments. So the EU cannot prescribe how to do this allocation, and this can create problems in many of the European countries. And one last thing, that an Oxfam report said that the richest 1% of the world's population is making more emissions than more than double of the emissions of the poorest half of the world population. And if this is the fact, then I think that carbon pricing is not enough, because the richest people, they can just pay it for the increased carbon price. There must be compulsory regulations to avoid the most dangerous activities which create the most emissions. And I am very skeptical that this can be done on a world level. So I think this problem is now above the capacities of local governments, and in this regard, it is also above the capacity of the national governments.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ivan. And picking up on what you said on different ways to mobilize the lower income population and the most marginalized residents. And I ask you to be brief because we only have 8 minutes to close down the event today. I'd like to ask Johanna, so how do you reach and mobilize the marginalized communities and residents and engage them in the built environment decarbonization processes in Malmö?
I would say there, because when we talk specifically about marginalized groups, they're usually tenants. They don't own their own housing, and because of that, I think, and they also have already other things to think about, honestly, how to get a work, how to make sure that my kids get a good school, how can we create a better future for ourselves. For example, it could probably be other things as well, but I feel like you shouldn't put the pressure on decarbonization, something that it's not theirs. I think we have to make sure that it's made. As I said before, we have our own housing company, for example. How do we make it without increasing the rents too much? How do we have this dialogue with the property owners? How do we create understanding for that? This is something, as Christopher said before, that this is something we have to do. But also to make it in a social and just way. But what we can also do, of course, there are also people who would want to be part of it, and then we should not exclude. But I think as well, it's about making the possibilities to be there, to make it easy. If you need to commute, it's easy to choose the way to do it sustainably. If I need to have a car, at least maybe I don't have to have a car by myself. I can choose to car share. There is one in the house where I live, for example. When we create when we look at the whole electricity grid, for example, how do we make sure that there's a lot of sustainable electricity or renewable electricity, for example, that it's affordable for a lot of people. So I would say it's more about creating the possibility to choose the sustainable ways rather than to put the pressure on those groups specifically.
Thank you so much, Johanna, and thank you all. I think it's a topic that we could stay and discuss for many hours. But given the time, I would just like to thank all of our panelists for this really good conversation and discussion. And so to close our panel discussion, we've heard from cities and practitioners around the world on what they've been doing to facilitate a sustainable and just transition in the housing sector. And now I will hand over to Caris, who will give an overview over what tools can local governments use to ensure a just transition in the built environment. So thank you all, and now over to you, Caris.
Thank you very much, Andrea, and a great thank you to all of the panelists for the great discussion. I think it was super interesting and really speaking towards what we're going to launch now. So this other exciting part of the webinar, I'll just run you through briefly through the policy brief. If we can go to the next slide. So as we heard today, there's an increasing understanding that the sustainable transition in the built environment cannot be environmentally sustainable if it isn't also socially sustainable. But it is really challenging to then factor in both environmental and social sustainability at the same time. We see that as cities are implementing policies to decarbonize the built environment, there's actually very various social impacts. So some initiatives are then helping those most in need, while others are then exacerbating inequality and leaving communities behind. So to offer a starting point for local governments, ICLEI and IHRB partnered up to develop a policy brief that outlines the tools that local governments can employ to work towards the just transition in the built environment, meeting environmental and social needs. Published today, this policy brief outlines 6 key tools which local governments can leverage to achieve both of these goals. The policy brief offers policy recommendations that are implementable by local governments globally, illustrated by case examples from different cities across the world who are taking committed action. The tools span the different leverage points that cities can effectuate across different categories. So the first one is legislation and regulation, which includes building codes, tenant protection laws, and business licensing, as well as land value capture. Then we have spatial planning that integrates land use infrastructure and maximizes the use of existing buildings. Then third, we have direct spending and fiscal measures. So this includes social housing, retrofit programs, land acquisitions, and fiscal measures that cities can take to tackle housing financialization. Then we have procurement, which ensures that human rights of communities and workers are guaranteed throughout the supply chain. We have proprietary powers that ensure publicly owned land, housing, and infrastructure achieves maximum social value. And then last, we have capacity building and advocacy. So this includes then upskilling and reskilling of the value chain, facilitating knowledge sharing, and advocating for national policy changes. Some of the examples of the tools then are mapping out abandoned and unoccupied land. So this is something that Brussels in Belgium is doing, where they created centralized mapping of vacant buildings to facilitate decision making. Then acquiring land or properties is done by Paris in France. They've introduced a right to have the first refusal. So if there's a multifamily building that is going to be sold, it's first offered to the city so that they can make social housing out of it at market price. And then lastly, another measure is to upgrade substandard housing, which is shown in Sao Paulo, the Slepe Favela. They work together with residents to then support them to develop new housing that is then formalized and in safer conditions, and that really responds to their needs. So that's a very brief overview. If we go to the next slide, you can access the policy brief here with the QR code or with the link that will also be shared in the chat. So I really encourage you to go through the different examples and the measures. And it's the first toolkit that really demonstrates both the just and sustainable transition in the built environment. So thank you very much for joining our session today. Before I hand back to Andrea to close, I would just like to invite you to our next session, which is happening tomorrow on building resilience in small island developing states and focusing on community-centered approaches. So this is looking at then how to mainstream inclusion, equity, and holistic planning for building resilience in small island community-centered approaches. So thank you very much, and back to Andrea.
Thank you so much, Caris. And unfortunately, we didn't have time for questions from the audience, but you are always welcome to reach to us by email or LinkedIn, and we'll make sure that we will answer all of your questions. We've heard diverse insights from our speakers today, from academia to the practitioners working in Malmö, Dortmund, and Jakarta. I would just like to thank you all for joining us today and encourage you to read the policy brief that Caris just presented. And I look forward to welcoming you at the next Daring Cities webinar. Thank you so much. Bye.